The children's handprints were still pressed into the cellar walls when Sheriff Marcus Walsh descended the wooden steps on October 15, 1987. Dozens of small palms outlined in what looked like rust-colored paint, stretching from floor to ceiling in the basement of the Blackwood house. The smell hit him next. Something sweet and medicinal mixed with decay, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. Walsh had seen plenty in his 23 years of law enforcement in Millbrook County, but nothing had prepared him for the rows of glass jars lining the shelves, each one carefully labeled with dates going back 30 years. Inside the jars floated what appeared to be organic specimens suspended in cloudy liquid. The labels bore names he recognized from missing person reports that had never been solved. At the center of the room sat a heavy wooden table, its surface carved with symbols that seemed to move in the flickering candlelight. The Blackwood family had lived in this house since 1952, and no neighbor had ever seen inside. Millbrook County stretched across rolling Pennsylvania hills where morning mist clung to dairy farms and abandoned coal mines dotted the landscape like scars. The town of Cedar Falls sat in the valley's heart. Population 817 souls who all knew each other's business, except when it came to the house on Thornfield Road. The Blackwood property occupied 12 acres at the county's edge, where the paved road turned to gravel and civilization gave way to dense woodland. A wrought iron fence surrounded the grounds, its gates always locked, rust bleeding down the black metal like tears. The Victorian mansion beyond rose 3 stories into the Pennsylvania sky, its windows dark even in daylight, covered by heavy curtains that never moved. Local children whispered that the Blackwood children never aged. Tommy Morrison swore he'd seen the same pale girl watching from an upstairs window for 15 years, her face unchanged since he was 7 years old. The postal worker left mail at the gate rather than approach the house, and delivery trucks turned around rather than risk the long driveway lined with dying oak trees. Ephraim Blackwood had purchased the property in 1952 with cash, according to courthouse records. He arrived with his wife Margaret and their 3 children, twins Edmund and Eleanor, both 12, and young Constance, barely 8. Neighbors remembered them from those first months, strange, quiet people who spoke in whispers and avoided eye contact. The family attended Cedar Falls Methodist Church exactly 6 times that first autumn. Reverend Patterson recalled Margaret Blackwood's hollow stare and the children's peculiar habit of holding hands throughout every service. Then winter came, and the Blackwoods vanished from public life entirely. Local businesses stopped receiving their custom. The children disappeared from school enrollment lists. When concerned citizens knocked on their door that spring, no one answered, though smoke continued rising from the chimney and lights flickered in the windows after dark. Dr. Harrison Kelly had been the Blackwoods' only regular visitor for over 3 decades. The county medical examiner drove his black sedan up Thornfield Road twice monthly, carrying a leather bag and leaving with sealed envelopes thick with cash. His medical records listed the Blackwood children as suffering from a rare genetic condition requiring constant supervision and treatment. Progressive developmental disorder, Kelly would tell anyone who asked, which wasn't often. The condition supposedly caused severe sensitivity to sunlight and required specialized medication, available only through private pharmaceutical contacts. It was a perfect cover for a family that preferred shadows. Kelly's arrangement with the Blackwoods generated more income than his entire medical practice. In exchange for signing death certificates, filing false medical reports, and maintaining absolute silence, he received payments that allowed him to purchase waterfront property and send his own children to expensive boarding schools. The conspiracy required more than one corrupt doctor. Judge Harold Brennan had dismissed multiple missing person inquiries over the years, citing lack of evidence or jurisdiction issues. His court records showed an unusual pattern. Whenever someone filed a report about strange activities near the Blackwood property, the case would disappear into administrative limbo. Sheriff's Deputy Frank Morrison, Tommy's father, had responded to exactly 17 calls about the Blackwood house between 1960 and 1985. His incident reports described each visit as welfare check completed, no evidence of disturbance. Morrison never mentioned what he actually saw beyond that locked gate, but his drinking increased dramatically after each visit. The network extended into the community's religious leadership. Reverend Patterson received annual donations from the Blackwood family, substantial enough to fund church repairs and purchase new hymnals. In return, he spread word that the family was devoutly religious, but preferred private worship due to their children's medical conditions. Linda Harrison had been Cedar Falls' head librarian for 18 years when she noticed the pattern in October of 1986. Someone was checking out books about anatomy, embalming techniques, and chemical preservation methods. The library cards showed different names: Smith, Johnson, Brown, but the handwriting was identical, and the books always returned exactly 2 weeks later in pristine condition. The requests escalated that autumn. Medical textbooks about surgical procedures, historical accounts of religious sacrifice, ancient texts about preservation rituals translated from Latin. Linda began keeping a private log of the borrower's activities, sensing something wrong in the careful selection of materials. The breakthrough came when she noticed the borrower had requested books through interlibrary loans from universities across Pennsylvania. One request particularly disturbed her: a 19th-century medical journal about preserving human specimens for anatomical study. The shipping address was a post office box registered to E. Blackwood. Linda contacted State Police Sergeant Michael Romano in late October. Romano had worked missing persons cases across 3 counties and recognized patterns others missed. When Linda showed him her log of borrowed materials, he cross-referenced the dates with unsolved disappearances in the region. The correlation was undeniable. Every time someone vanished in Millbrook or surrounding counties, the mysterious library patron would subsequently borrow materials related to anatomy or preservation. The timing suggested the borrower was studying techniques after acquiring test subjects. Romano began his own investigation that November. He discovered the post office box had been rented continuously since 1958, always paid in cash, always registered to a member of the Blackwood family. The postal clerk remembered the family members who visited the box: pale, thin people who spoke in whispers and always wore heavy coats regardless of weather. The investigation faced immediate obstacles. Sheriff Walsh dismissed Romano's concerns as conspiracy theories and refused to authorize surveillance of the Blackwood property. Dr. Kelly claimed patient confidentiality prevented him from discussing the family's medical conditions. Judge Brennan suggested Romano focus on legitimate police work instead of harassing respectable citizens. But Romano persisted, driven by memories of families who never found closure. 23 people had vanished in the region over 30 years, their disappearances spanning decades, but sharing disturbing similarities. Most were young adults traveling alone. All had been seen last near roads that connected to Thornfield Road. None had left behind any trace. Dr. Margaret Roth arrived in Cedar Falls as the new county health inspector in January of 1987. Her mandate included reviewing long-term medical cases to ensure proper care standards, and the Blackwood file immediately caught her attention. According to Dr. Kelly's records, 3 children had been receiving treatment for the same rare condition for 35 years without any change in their status. Roth requested a home visit to assess the family's medical needs. Dr. Kelly initially refused, claiming the children were too fragile for outside contact. When Roth threatened to involve state health authorities, he agreed to arrange a meeting at the Blackwood house, warning that any disruption to the children's routine could prove fatal. The visit occurred on February 23, 1987. Dr. Kelly met Roth at the gates and escorted her up the overgrown driveway. The house loomed before them, its Victorian architecture twisted by decades of neglect. Paint peeled from the weathered siding like diseased skin, and the wraparound porch sagged under the weight of rotting timber. Ephraim Blackwood answered the door, a tall, gaunt man whose age seemed impossible to determine. His hair was white as bone, his skin pale as wax, and his eyes held an intelligence that made Roth's skin crawl. He spoke in careful, measured sentences, welcoming them into his home with the courtesy of a funeral director. The interior smelled of antiseptic and something else, something organic and sweet that made Roth's stomach turn. Heavy curtains blocked all natural light, and oil lamps provided flickering illumination that cast dancing shadows on the walls. The furniture looked antique but well-maintained, as if time had stopped moving inside the house. Margaret Blackwood appeared in the parlor doorway, her appearance equally unsettling. She wore a black dress that might have been fashionable in 1950, and her smile never reached her eyes. She moved with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to receiving visitors under unusual circumstances. "Our children are resting," she explained when Roth asked to examine them. "They tire so easily, and strangers upset their delicate constitution." From behind closed doors came the sound of childish laughter. Sergeant Romano's investigation revealed a disturbing pattern in the timing of local disappearances. Using library records, police reports, and interviews with families of the missing, he constructed a timeline that showed the vanishings occurred in clusters around specific dates throughout the year. The pattern followed an ancient calendar of seasonal transitions: spring equinox, summer solstice, autumn harvest, and winter's darkest night. Each cluster contained 3 to 4 disappearances spread across a 2-week period, as if the perpetrator was selecting candidates for specific purposes. Romano studied historical records dating back to the 1800s and found similar patterns in the region's folklore. Native American tribes had considered the area spiritually significant, believing the land contained portals between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Early European settlers reported strange lights in the forest and voices speaking in unknown languages on certain nights. The Blackwood property sat at the center of these historical reports. Home records from the 1860s described attempts to bless the land after several families reported supernatural disturbances. A Catholic priest named Father O'Malley had performed exorcisms at 3 different houses built on the same site before the current mansion was constructed. Local newspaper archives contained scattered references to unusual activities in the area. The Cedar Falls Gazette had published several articles in the early 1900s about spiritual gatherings held on private property outside town. These meetings allegedly involved participants from across Pennsylvania who came to witness what they called demonstrations of eternal preservation. Romano discovered that Ephraim Blackwood's grandfather had owned property in the same location during the 1890s. Family genealogy records showed the Blackwoods had maintained a presence in the region for over a century, passing the land and its secrets from one generation to the next. The seasonal timing explained why the disappearances had gone unnoticed for so long. Spread across months and years, with victims chosen from different communities, The pattern remained invisible to local investigators, who rarely collaborated across jurisdictional lines. But the pattern was accelerating. Romano's investigation led him to similar cases across Pennsylvania and neighboring states. In rural communities throughout the region, families reported relatives who had vanished without trace near properties owned by reclusive, multi-generational clans. The cases shared disturbing similarities: isolated compounds, mysterious medical conditions, and local officials who seemed unusually reluctant to investigate. In Bradford County, the Whitmore family had lived in seclusion since 1928. Their neighbors reported strange lights and sounds from their property, but sheriff's deputies consistently found no evidence of wrongdoing. 3 generations of Whitmores claimed to suffer from the same rare blood disorder that required them to avoid sunlight and maintain strict isolation. In Jefferson County, the Ashford family operated what they called a private medical facility on 80 acres of wooded land. Local authorities received occasional reports of people entering the property who were never seen leaving, but investigations always concluded that the visitors had departed through back roads that connected to other counties. Romano identified at least 12 similar families operating in Pennsylvania alone, each claiming hereditary medical conditions that justified their isolation. The families maintained minimal contact with their communities, but wielded unusual influence over local law enforcement, medical professionals, and judicial officials. The network appeared to be coordinated. Romano found evidence of communication between the families through coded classified advertisements in regional newspapers. The ads used agricultural terminology to discuss livestock management and preservation techniques, but the language clearly referred to human subjects. Financial records revealed suspicious patterns in property transactions. The families frequently purchased land from each other using shell companies and private trusts. They also shared resources, including specialized equipment shipped between properties in unmarked vehicles. Medical supply companies across 3 states had filled unusual orders for embalming fluids, surgical instruments, and chemical preservatives. The orders were placed by different doctors but shipped to post office boxes controlled by the network families. Dr. Kelly's name appeared on several invoices, suggesting his involvement extended beyond the Blackwood case. The scope was larger than anyone had imagined. Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins had lived across from the Blackwood property for 43 years. Her farmhouse sat on a hill overlooking Thornfield Road, providing a clear view of the mansion's grounds and the occasional visitors who arrived after midnight. She had witnessed things that haunted her dreams, but fear and social pressure had kept her silent for decades. The sounds were the worst part. On certain nights, when the wind was still and the air hung heavy with moisture, Eleanor could hear voices carried across the distance between properties. Sometimes the voices sounded like children playing games, their laughter echoing through the darkness. Other times she heard screaming that would start suddenly and stop just as abruptly, leaving only the sound of nocturnal insects filling the silence. Eleanor had called Sheriff Walsh exactly once, in the autumn of 1974. She reported strange lights moving through the Blackwood property and what sounded like a woman crying for help. Walsh arrived 30 minutes later and spent exactly 10 minutes examining the Blackwood house before returning to Eleanor's farm. "I didn't see anything unusual," he told her. "Those old houses make all kinds of noises in the wind. Maybe you should consider moving somewhere with closer neighbors if the isolation bothers you." The message was clear. Eleanor could report what she saw, but no one would act on her information. The social cost of speaking out would be her reputation as a reliable witness and possibly her standing in the community. The local rumor mill would brand her as an unstable woman who saw threats where none existed. Eleanor watched over the years as other neighbors tried to raise concerns about the Blackwood family. Each person who spoke out found themselves marginalized, their businesses losing customers or their children facing social exclusion at school. The message spread through the community without being spoken. Maintaining silence about the Blackwoods was the price of social acceptance in Cedar Falls. What would you do if you witnessed evidence of serious crimes, but knew that reporting them would destroy your life while accomplishing nothing? Eleanor faced this choice every time she heard those voices in the darkness. She could call authorities who wouldn't investigate, sacrificing her reputation for an empty gesture. Or she could remain silent, complicit in whatever was happening behind that locked gate. She chose silence, like everyone else. Dr. Harrison Kelly's world began unraveling in September of 1987 when his son David returned from medical school with questions about his father's unusual practice. David had been accepted into a pathology residency program and wanted to understand how his father had developed expertise in rare genetic disorders. The questions started innocently enough. David asked about the Blackwood family's condition and why they required such extensive isolation. He wanted to review the medical literature about progressive developmental disorders to better understand the case that had funded his expensive education. Dr. Kelly's initial responses were vague and deflective. He claimed the condition was so rare that most medical journals hadn't published current research. He suggested David focus on his residency requirements, rather than spending time on cases that wouldn't advance his career. But David persisted. He contacted medical schools across the country, searching for information about the specific disorder his father described. No geneticist or pediatric specialist had heard of a condition matching the symptoms Dr. Kelly had documented in the Blackwood children. The confrontation occurred on October 1st, when David presented his father with research proving that no such genetic disorder existed. The symptoms Dr. Kelly had described were medically impossible, and the treatment protocols he'd documented made no scientific sense. "What have you been doing for 35 years?" David demanded. "What are you hiding about that family?" Dr. Kelly's breakdown was complete and immediate. The weight of decades of guilt and fear poured out in a confession that revealed the true nature of his relationship with the Blackwoods. They weren't patients receiving medical treatment. They were operators of a sophisticated preservation laboratory, and Dr. Kelly was their silent partner in maintaining the cover story that protected their activities. The payments Dr. Kelly received weren't medical fees, but silence money. In exchange for falsifying death certificates, covering up missing person investigations, and providing medical equipment through legitimate channels, the Blackwoods ensured that Dr. Kelly's family enjoyed financial security and social status. But the price was becoming unbearable. David Kelly convinced his father to provide state police with detailed information about the Blackwood operation. The doctor's confession led Romano and a specialized investigation team to obtain search warrants for both the Blackwood property and Dr. Kelly's office records. The search of Dr. Kelly's files revealed meticulous documentation of his collaboration with the Blackwood family spanning 35 years. Hidden in a secret compartment behind his filing cabinet was a leather-bound journal containing records that would have destroyed multiple lives if discovered earlier. Dr. Kelly had documented every visit to the Blackwood property, every falsified death certificate, and every suspicious request for medical equipment. The journal entries were written in medical code, disguising the true nature of the activities as legitimate patient care. But translated into plain language, they revealed a systematic operation involving human experimentation and preservation. The Blackwoods had been perfecting techniques for maintaining human consciousness in preserved specimens. Dr. Kelly's notes described procedures that combined elements of embalming, surgical modification, and chemical treatment to create what they called permanent specimens. The subjects remained aware and responsive, but were physically transformed into preserved displays. The journal contained sketches of the laboratory equipment Dr. Kelly had helped procure. Specialized tanks for maintaining specimens in preservative solutions. Surgical instruments designed for precise nerve preservation. Chemical compounds that maintain tissue elasticity while preventing decomposition. Most disturbing were the progress notes about individual subjects. Dr. Kelly had assigned each preserved person a number and tracked their condition over years of captivity. Some specimens had maintained consciousness for decades, their awareness trapped in bodies that could no longer move or communicate normally. The Blackwood children weren't aging because they weren't entirely human anymore. They had been among the first successful specimens, preserved in a state between life and death that allowed them to assist with the family's work while serving as proof of concept for their preservation techniques. 23 people had become living experiments. The search warrant for the Blackwood property was executed on October 14, 1987. A team of state investigators approached the mansion at dawn, expecting resistance but finding the gates standing open and no one visible on the grounds. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the house felt abandoned, though recent signs of habitation were evident in the kitchen and parlor. Oil lamps still flickered in their holders, casting shifting shadows on walls covered with antique photographs of the Blackwood family spanning multiple generations. The investigators found the entrance to the cellar laboratory, behind a bookshelf in Ephraim Blackwood's study. A hidden mechanism opened the shelf to reveal stone steps descending into the foundation. The air that rose from the depths carried the sweet chemical smell that would haunt investigators for years afterward. Sheriff Walsh descended first, followed by Romano and forensic specialist Dr. Patricia Hoffman. The basement stretched beneath the entire house, divided into multiple chambers connected by narrow corridors carved from the native stone. Electric lighting had been installed decades earlier, illuminating a workshop that belonged in a medical school rather than a private home. The preservation laboratory occupied the largest chamber. Glass tanks lined the walls, each one containing a human figure suspended in cloudy preservative solution. The specimens floated in positions that suggested they had been carefully arranged, their ambiance faces turned toward observers as if welcoming visitors to a museum of horrors. Labels attached to each tank provided names, dates, and notes about the preservation process. Romano recognized several names from missing person reports he had investigated. Others matched cases from neighboring counties going back decades. The specimens appeared to be organized chronologically, creating a timeline of the Blackwood family's experiments. In the center of the laboratory sat the operating table Romano had seen through the cellar windows. Surgical instruments were arranged precisely on nearby trays, and medical charts documented procedures performed on each specimen. The level of detail suggested the Blackwoods approached their work with scientific methodology. The most disturbing discovery was evidence that some specimens remained conscious and aware despite their preservation. Monitoring equipment tracked brain activity, and handwritten notes described attempts to communicate with preserved subjects through eye movements and other subtle responses. The children's handprints on the walls marked their territory. Dr. Patricia Hoffman's forensic examination revealed that the preservation process had created a state between life and death that challenged medical understanding. The subjects retained brain function and sensory awareness, while their bodies were chemically altered to prevent decomposition. The process began with surgical modification of the nervous system to maintain consciousness while reducing physical sensation. The Blackwoods had developed techniques for preserving nerve pathways while allowing chemical penetration of muscle and organ tissue. Specialized embalming fluids replaced blood circulation, maintaining tissue integrity while providing nutrients to support brain function. The subjects remained alive in the medical sense, but were physically transformed into preserved specimens that could survive indefinitely in controlled conditions. The horror was not just that people had been murdered, it was that they had been kept alive during their transformation into museum pieces. Dr. Hoffman's examination suggested that several specimens retained enough awareness to experience their captivity, but lacked the physical capability to communicate or escape. The Blackwood children represented the most successful applications of the preservation technology. They had been transformed decades earlier, but retained greater physical mobility and communication abilities. They served as assistants in capturing and processing new specimens, while demonstrating the potential for long-term preservation of consciousness. Financial records found in the laboratory revealed that the Blackwood family had been selling their preservation services to wealthy clients across the region. Some customers paid to have deceased relatives preserved in lifelike conditions. Others requested the capture and preservation of specific individuals for private collections. The operation generated substantial income through multiple revenue streams. Medical professionals paid for access to perfectly preserved anatomical specimens. Private collectors purchased preserved subjects for reasons the investigators preferred not to contemplate. Research institutions acquired samples of preservation chemicals for legitimate scientific study. But the Blackwood family had vanished. The investigation of the Blackwood property triggered a coordinated law enforcement operation across Pennsylvania and neighboring states. Romano's research had identified similar families operating preservation laboratories, and search warrants were executed simultaneously at 12 locations. The raids revealed that the Blackwood operation was part of a network that had been active for over a century. Each family specialized in different aspects of the preservation process, sharing techniques and resources while maintaining security through geographic separation. The Whitmore family in Bradford County operated what appeared to be a legitimate medical research facility, but was actually developing new preservation chemicals. Their laboratory contained detailed formulations for the compounds used to maintain specimen consciousness, while preventing tissue decomposition. The Ashford family in Jefferson County ran a procurement operation, identifying and capturing subjects for preservation by other network members. Their property contained detailed surveillance records on hundreds of potential victims, including photographs, daily routines, and vulnerability assessments. Other families served as distribution centers, shipping preserved specimens to private collectors and research institutions. They maintained legitimate businesses as cover for their activities, including funeral homes, medical supply companies, and private security firms. The network's influence extended into government agencies, law enforcement organizations, and medical institutions. Dozens of officials had been compromised through bribes, blackmail, or direct participation in preservation activities. The corruption was systemic and had protected the network for decades. Dr. Kelly's cooperation led to the arrests of 37 individuals across 4 states. The charges included kidnapping, murder, conspiracy, and racketeering. Several defendants agreed to provide information about the network's structure in exchange for reduced sentences. But the core Blackwood family members remained at large. Ephraim, Margaret, and their preserved children had disappeared from the mansion before investigators arrived. Financial records suggested they had been planning their evacuation for weeks, possibly alerted by sources within law enforcement agencies. The hunt for the Blackwoods would continue for years. The prosecutions resulting from Operation Specimen, as the investigation came to be known, revealed the challenges of seeking justice for crimes that fell outside normal legal frameworks. How do you charge someone with murdering victims who remain technically alive, but irreversibly transformed? Federal prosecutors worked with forensic psychiatrists and medical ethicists to develop legal strategies for addressing the preservation crimes. The court proceedings required expert testimony about consciousness, death, and what constituted human existence in cases where traditional boundaries had been obliterated. Many defendants pleaded guilty to avoid trials that would have exposed the full scope of their activities. Dr. Kelly received a 15-year sentence in exchange for his cooperation and testimony against other network members. Judge Brennan was removed from the bench and faced criminal charges for obstruction of justice. The preserved specimens presented the most difficult challenge. Medical experts disagreed about whether restoration to normal human condition was possible or advisable. Some specimens had been preserved for decades and might not survive reversal procedures, while others showed signs of psychological trauma from their captivity. Families of missing persons faced impossible choices about whether to pursue restoration treatments for relatives who had been transformed into preserved specimens. The procedures were experimental and dangerous, with no guarantee of success. Some families chose to maintain their loved ones in preservation until better treatment options became available. Dr. Patricia Hoffman established a specialized medical unit at Penn State University to study the preservation process and develop potential reversal techniques. The unit operated under strict security protocols, treating the preserved specimens as patients rather than evidence while seeking ways to restore their humanity. The legal proceedings attracted international attention from medical ethicists, human rights organizations, and religious leaders who debated the moral implications of the preservation technology. Some argued that the specimens retained enough humanity to deserve protection and care, while others believed that ending their suffering was the most merciful option. 23 preserved people awaited uncertain futures. The Blackwood mansion stood empty for 18 months after the investigation, its windows boarded and grounds fenced with razor wire. The property became a crime scene that challenged preservation protocols. How do you maintain evidence when the evidence includes living human beings in artificial preservation? Local residents reported strange phenomena around the abandoned property. Lights appeared in the mansion windows despite disconnected electrical service. Neighbors heard voices and movement from inside the house during late-night hours. Some witnesses claimed to see figures moving through the rooms, but police investigations found no evidence of unauthorized entry. The mansion was demolished in March of 1989 after structural engineers declared it unsafe for human occupancy. The demolition crew reported unusual discoveries during the destruction process, including additional hidden chambers that had not been found during the initial investigation. The preserved specimens were transferred to the specialized medical facility at Penn State, where Dr. Hoffman's team continued developing restoration procedures. 3 specimens were successfully returned to normal human condition, though they required extensive psychological treatment to address trauma from their preservation experience. The Blackwood family was never captured. Interpol investigations suggested they had fled to Eastern Europe, where similar preservation networks operated with less law enforcement scrutiny. Unconfirmed sightings placed them in Romania, Czech Republic, and Poland, but efforts to locate them proved unsuccessful. The preservation technology developed by the Blackwood network found legitimate applications in medical research and organ transplantation. Dr. Hoffman's team published papers about consciousness preservation that advanced understanding of brain function and death. The knowledge gained from studying the specimens contributed to breakthroughs in neurology and surgical medicine. But the ethical implications of the research remained controversial. Critics argued that any knowledge derived from the Blackwood experiments was tainted by the circumstances of its acquisition and should not be used to benefit others. Supporters claimed that refusing to learn from the specimens would compound the tragedy by wasting opportunities to advance medical science. The debate continues today. The Penn State Medical Facility closed its preservation research program in 2003, citing funding limitations and ethical concerns. The surviving specimens were transferred to a classified government research facility where their conditions are monitored, but their identities remain protected. Cedar Falls never recovered from the scandal. The revelation of decades-long complicity in preservation crimes destroyed the community's reputation and drove away businesses and residents. The population dropped to fewer than 300 people, and most of the abandoned buildings were eventually demolished or left to decay. Sheriff Walsh retired early and moved to Florida, where he died in 2007 without ever publicly discussing his role in enabling the Blackwood operation. His personal papers, donated to the local historical society, were sealed for 50 years at his family's request. Dr. Harrison Kelly was released from federal prison in 2002 and spent his remaining years working at free medical clinics in urban areas. He died in 2012, and his son David established a foundation providing mental health services to victims of medical abuse. Sergeant Michael Romano became head of Pennsylvania's Missing Persons Unit and developed protocols for investigating cases involving isolated communities and suspicious medical practices. His training programs are now used by law enforcement agencies across the United States. The Thornfield Road property was purchased by the state and converted to a nature preserve. A small memorial plaque honors the victims of the preservation experiments, but no marker identifies the location of the former Blackwood mansion. Hikers sometimes report finding pieces of medical equipment in the forest, remnants of a laboratory that transformed science into horror. Local residents still whisper about seeing the Blackwood children in the surrounding woods, their pale faces appearing among the trees before vanishing into shadow. People in Cedar Falls still whisper about the house where children never aged, and neighbors never questioned what happened behind locked doors. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.